The American West, 1,880. A mountain pass outside Ridgecrest, the last stagecoach before the storm. 6 riders burst from the tree line, guns drawn, blocking the road whole. A woman stepped out of the coach. No screaming, no trembling. She knelt beside the man who'd just dropped 3 armed riders with 2 shots blood soaking through his sleeve and looked him dead in the eye. That's not a medical assessment, that's a wish. Jed O'Sullivan, who had faced down 6 armed men, without blinking, opened his mouth and had nothing to say. A doctor who refused to be silent. A gunman who forgot how to run, and a town being killed slowly by the most powerful man in the valley. Some secrets don't stay buried, not when the right woman rides into town. Full story below, don't say I didn't warn you. The stagecoach rocked hard on the mountain road, and Abby grabbed the leather strap above the window to steady herself. She didn't mind the jostling. After 3 weeks of travel city to city, rail to rail, and now this final stretch of raw frontier, she had made peace with discomfort. Outside, the land was enormous. That was the only word that fit. The peaks rose blood red in the dying afternoon light, slashed through with dark pines and granite faces, wet from the coming rain. No painting she had ever seen in Boston captured it right. The artists always made it look romantic. Pretty. This was neither. This was just enormous, ancient, and completely indifferent to human opinion. She pressed her palm flat against the dusty window glass and felt the cold radiating off it. Good, she thought, exactly where I'm supposed to be. The driver, a heavy-set man named Briggs, had barely spoken since they left Ridgecrest. That suited her fine. She had medical supply crates strapped to the roof and a case of instruments beside her on the bench seat. She ran her fingers across the latch without thinking. A habit, making sure everything was still there. The coach lurched sideways. Not from the road, from something else. A shot cracked through the mountain air, sharp and flat. The way gunfire sounds when it bounces off rock walls. Then another. Briggs swore loud enough for her to hear it through the roof, and the horses screamed, and the whole world tilted as the stagecoach slid sideways on the rain-slicked gravel and came to a grinding, shuddering stop. Abby was already braced. She pulled back the window curtain and saw them. 5 riders, maybe 6. They came from the tree line on both sides of the road, blocking the pass completely. Dark coats, no badges. One of them fired a shot into the air, and the boom of it echoed off the canyon walls like a cannon. "Down off the box, fat man," one of them shouted at Briggs. Abby set her jaw. Her heart was hammering, but she didn't let it move through her hands. She set the instrument case flat on the floor and pressed herself against the inside wall, thinking through what she had and what she didn't. No weapon, no horse. A scalpel in her coat pocket, which was essentially useless against 6 armed men on horseback. She heard Briggs hit the ground and stumble, heard them laugh. Then she heard something else. A single rifle shot from somewhere up and to the right. Clean, deliberate, not panicked. One of the riders at the front of the group grabbed his arm and his horse went sideways. Another shot almost immediately after the first, and a second rider's pistol spun out of his hand and clattered across the gravel. The whole group scattered, just for a moment, but enough. She pushed the coach door open. The man on the ridge was already moving. He came down the rock face in long, fluid strides, his rifle up and sweeping, and he moved with the kind of absolute certainty that comes from years of knowing where your feet are at all times. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a battered canvas duster that was already dark with rain. He had a second weapon drawn before he hit the road, a long-barreled Colt that looked like an extension of his arm. He didn't say a word. He didn't threaten. He simply stepped into the center of the road with the rifle aimed at the nearest rider's chest and waited. The riders looked at each other. 4 of you. Left, the man said quietly. One of me, I like those numbers. One of them tried it. He spurred his horse and came hard from the left flank. The man dropped into a low step, let the horse barrel past, grabbed the rider by the coat, and yanked him clean out of the saddle. The man hit the gravel and didn't get up. The colt came back up before the other three had finished flinching. That was enough. The remaining riders turned their horses and were gone back through the pines. Inside of 20 seconds, hoofbeats swallowed up by the distant thunder rolling in over the ridges. Silence. Rain began to fall. Soft at first, then harder. The man straightened slowly. He tucked the colt back into his holster and looked down the road where the riders had disappeared. His expression didn't change. Whatever he was feeling, he kept it somewhere deep and apparently well-guarded. Abby stepped out of the coach. "You're hit," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were gray. Not blue-gray or silver, just gray. The same color as the granite behind him. "It's a graze," he said. "That's not a medical assessment. That's a wish." She had already opened her bag. "Sit down somewhere. The running board will do." He looked at the running board. He looked back at her. "I'm fine," he said. "Your sleeve is soaked through, and I don't think it's from the rain." She pulled out her suture kit, without waiting for him to answer, and gestured at the board again. "Sit." He sat, slowly, like a man who wasn't accustomed to being told what to do, and was deciding whether to make an issue of it. He decided not to. She wasn't sure if that was good sense on his part, or simple exhaustion. She cut the sleeve back with her scissors. The wound ran 3 inches across the top of his left shoulder. A rifle ball had shaved a channel through the skin and muscle without hitting bone. Lucky. Messy, but lucky. Her hands were steady. They were always steady during the work. That was something she had discovered in her first year of medical training, when everything else, her confidence, her composure, her ability to answer a professor's question in a room full of men who thought she had no business being there, had been shaky and uncertain. But her hands held. She cleaned the wound and threaded the needle. "This is going to sting," she said. "I've been shot before," he said. "This is going to sting anyway." She began the first stitch. He didn't move. She gave him that much. "What's your name, Jed?" he said, a pause. "Jed O'Sullivan." "Abigail Fairchild." She pulled the second stitch through. "I'm the new physician in Blackwood." Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, more like a rearrangement. "They sent a woman," he said. "Nobody sent me. I applied for the position, was accepted, and came of my own choosing." She tied off the stitch and moved to the third. "Is that going to be a problem for you, Mr. O'Sullivan?" "No," he said. "Good." She worked in silence for a minute. The rain came down steadily now and drummed against the coach roof and the canvas of his duster. Briggs was somewhere behind her, checking on the horses and saying nothing useful. "Fragile eastern bird like you," Jed said finally, not unkindly, "might find the frontier a little rougher than she bargained for." Abby finished the last stitch, tied it off with 2 clean knots, and pressed a folded gauze pad over the wound. She looked up at him. "Anatomically speaking," she said calmly, "the human clavicle bears approximately 77 pounds of tensile stress before fracture. The supraspinatus tendon tears at roughly 16 newtons of lateral force. I can describe in clinical detail exactly how much structural damage a man your size can sustain before he becomes a liability instead of an asset." She began wrapping the bandage. "Would you like me to continue? Or would you prefer to revise your assessment of who is fragile?" Jed looked at her for a long moment. He didn't have anything to say to that. She hadn't expected him to. She tied off the bandage, packed her kit, and stood up. "You'll need to keep that clean and dry. Change the dressing tomorrow and the day after. If you develop fever or the wound shows discharge with color, come find me." She picked up her bag. "You know where I'll be." She climbed back into the coach. Briggs had gotten the horses calmed down and was pulling himself back up to the box. Just before she pulled the door shut, she leaned out and said it clearly, because she had been thinking it since they stopped. Not at Jed specifically, at the road, at the mountain, at whatever was waiting in Blackwood that would require her to say it again and again until it took root. "Medicine doesn't care about a man's pedigree or the depth of his pockets," she said. "Every life on this frontier deserves the same dignity and care." Jed stood in the rain beside the road and watched the stagecoach pull away. He put one hand to his freshly bandaged shoulder without thinking about it. The stoic cowboy, who had faced down 6 armed men without blinking, stood there for a moment, looking at the empty road. Then he turned and walked back up the ridge, into the rain and the darkening sky, and said nothing at all. Blackwood was not what she had pictured. She had pictured a town. What she found was more like an argument, a collection of raw timber buildings and canvas structures and wagon-rutted mud streets that hadn't yet decided whether they were a permanent settlement or a temporary camp. The main street ran straight and wide and stopped abruptly at the base of a granite escarpment, as though the mountain had drawn a line and dared anyone to cross it. The quarry sat beyond that line. You could hear it before you could see it. A constant low percussion of drill steel against rock, punctuated by muffled blasting charges that sent small tremors through the ground at irregular intervals. Abby had felt the first one through the soles of her boots on her second morning and nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. By the fourth morning, she barely noticed it. Her clinic was 2 rooms off the main street, sandwiched between a dry goods store and a leather shop that smelled powerfully of tallow. The previous physician had left behind a wooden examination table, a cracked wash basin, and almost nothing else. The supply crates she had brought from the east took up most of the available floor space for the first 3 days, while she sorted and arranged and built order out of the mess. She had seen her first patient before she finished unpacking. A quarry worker, 30 years old at most, who looked 50. He had come in, holding his right hand wrapped in a filthy cloth, and said nothing until she asked him directly what happened. Then 3 more came. Then 7. By the end of the first week, she had a problem she hadn't fully anticipated. Not a shortage of patients. She had expected that. The problem was that the same injuries and symptoms kept appearing in the same bodies. Chronic cough that went too deep to be ordinary dust inhalation. Skin lesions on the forearms and neck. Headaches behind the eyes that the men described as pressure rather than pain. 2 of them had tremors in their hands bad enough to affect their grip. She started writing everything down. Mateo was the one who explained it to her. He came in on a Tuesday morning, supporting his younger brother, Tomas, who had the deep cough and the hand tremors both. Mateo was maybe 25, compact and serious-faced, with the unhurried precision of someone who chose every word deliberately because he had learned that careless words in this town carried consequences. While Abby examined Tomas, Mateo stood near the door with his hat in both hands and watched. "How long has he had this cough?" she asked. 4 months, Mateo said, "since they moved us to the lower tunnel." "What's different about the lower tunnel?" Mateo was quiet for a moment. "The water runs through it. Brown water. They say it's natural, from the rock." He paused again. "They say a lot of things." Abby looked at Tomas's fingernails. Pale beds. She looked at his eyes. She pressed 2 fingers along the line of his jaw and felt the lymph nodes there enlarged, tender enough that Tomas flinched. She wrote it all down, without letting her expression show what she was thinking. "I want him off the lower tunnel work," she said, "and I want him drinking nothing but water from the upper spring on the north ridge, not from the quarry source." Mateo nodded slowly. "The foreman won't like that." "Tell him," Dr. Fairchild said, "it's a medical directive." She looked up. "Tell him I'll be happy to explain it to him in person if he has questions." Something shifted in Mateo's face. It wasn't quite a smile. More like a door opening slightly. She was midway through writing up her notes on Tomas when the bell above the clinic door sounded, and a different kind of presence filled the room. She knew before she turned around. Baron Thorne was tall, well-dressed in the frontier fashion, which meant expensive boots and a good coat rather than a suit, a studied informality that was calculated to say, "I belong here," without saying it out loud. He had silver at his temples, and the polished, measured smile of a man who had practiced it until it felt natural. He looked around the clinic with his hands clasped behind his back, taking inventory without appearing to. "Dr. Fairchild." He said her name with warmth. "I've been meaning to come by since you arrived. I'm Reginald Thorne. I suspect you've already heard the name." "I have," she said. She didn't stand. If that bothered him, he didn't let it show. He moved through the room with easy propriety, pausing to look at the row of medicine bottles on the shelf, as though they interested him. "This valley is important to me," he said. "I've invested considerably in its future. Schools, roads, the quarry operation that employs a significant portion of this town's population." He turned and looked at her with the smile still in place. "When I heard a physician was coming, I was genuinely delighted. A healthy workforce is a productive workforce. I'd like to offer whatever support I can." "That's generous," Abby said. "I mean it sincerely. Then I'll take you at your word." She set down her pen and looked at him directly. "I'd like access to the quarry medical records, whatever the previous physician kept on file regarding worker injuries and illness." A pause. "Brief, but there, of course," Thorne said. "I'll have my office look into what's available. These things get disorganized." He spread his hands, apologetically. "You know how it is, I'm sure." She kept her voice pleasant. "I'd also like to conduct a water quality assessment on the lower tunnel drainage. I'm seeing patterns in my patients that suggest possible chemical exposure, and the responsible course of action is to identify the source." This pause was longer. "I can appreciate your thoroughness," Thorne said, "though I'd caution you against alarming the workers unnecessarily. These men have a tendency toward superstition. Rumors spread quickly in a closed community like this, and an unfounded concern can do real damage to morale." He smiled again. "I'm sure you understand." "I understand completely," Abby said, "which is why I'd like to conduct the assessment quietly and professionally rather than raising any public concern before I have confirmed findings." Thorne looked at her for a moment with an expression that was still pleasant and completely opaque. Then he inclined his head. "I'll arrange it," he said. "It was a genuine pleasure, Dr. Fairchild. Blackwood is lucky to have you." He left. The bell above the door sounded again. Abby sat still for 10 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and wrote the date and Thorne's name at the top of a fresh page and began writing down every word of the conversation she could remember. She didn't know yet exactly what she was building, but she was going to build it carefully. She was in the middle of a midday consultation with a wife about her daughter's fever when the shouting started outside. She came out the front door at a walk that became a run by the second step. The scene was at the edge of the open yard between the clinic and the quarry road. A mine overseer, broad man, red-faced, with a leather strap, coiled in his right fist, had a boy of maybe 11 backed against the wooden fence rails. The boy was small and dark-eyed and wearing a canvas apron 3 sizes too large for him. He wasn't crying. He had his chin up and his jaw set with a dignity that was almost painful to see in something that small. The overseer was saying something about a cart and a broken axle and the cost of it coming out of someone's wages. His voice was loud enough to carry to the street. People had stopped to look, but nobody was moving. Abby walked directly into the space between them. She was aware, in a peripheral and unemotional way, that the overseer had a good 8 inches and 100 pounds on her. She noted it the same way she noted a patient's vital signs. Information to work with. "Step back," she said. The overseer looked at her with naked irritation. "This doesn't concern you, lady. That child is one of my patients, and he's on his feet, which means you're going to lower that strap, and this conversation is going to end right now." She kept her voice even, not quiet, not loud, even. "If you have a grievance about a broken axle, you take it to the site manager in writing. You do not take it out on an 11-year-old with a leather strap. He costs the company." "He is 11 years old," Abby said. She turned to the boy who had not moved. "Go inside the clinic. There's a cup of water on the table by the door. Sit down and drink it." The boy looked at her for a moment. Then he went. The overseer was still standing there with his face getting redder. Abby turned back to him calmly. "The blood of a miner runs just as red as the blood of a banker," she said, clear and steady, loud enough that the people watching could hear every word. No amount of gold gives you the right to strip a human being of their dignity. She didn't wait to see how he took it. She walked back to the clinic. Her hands were not shaking. She checked, deliberately, and they weren't. She didn't see Jed O'Sullivan until she was back inside. He was across the street, leaning against the post of the farrier's stable with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, watching the spot where the overseer had been standing. He had apparently been there for a while. He didn't look her way, but when the overseer turned and walked back toward the quarry road without another word, something in Jed's posture eased almost imperceptibly. Abby went back inside and found the boy sitting exactly where she'd told him to sit, drinking his water with both hands wrapped around the cup. She sat down across from him and asked him his name. He told her. She wrote it in her book. Then she got out her stethoscope and went to work. She smelled the smoke before she heard anything. It woke her out of a light sleep, that specific acrid edge underneath ordinary wood smoke. The chemical sharpness that meant something was burning. That wasn't meant to burn. She was on her feet and moving before she was fully conscious of deciding to move. The shed was attached to the back of the clinic building. It held her overflow supplies, the crates she hadn't fully processed yet, back medicines, the surgical instruments she hadn't found wall space for. The door was padlocked. She had padlocked it herself. The padlock was on the ground when she got to the alley. Cut. The flames were already inside the shed walls, orange light showing through the gaps in the timber boards, smoke pouring from the ventilation gap under the roof. She grabbed the door handle, and the heat hit her palm, and she pulled back. But there was a crate just visible through the gap at the base of the door. Her case of quinine, her forceps set, the spare suture supplies she would not be able to replace inside of 2 months. She was reaching for the door again, when a hand closed on her upper arm and pulled her backward with a force that lifted her heels off the ground. "Don't," said Jed's voice directly behind her ear. "My supplies are not worth your hands." He moved past her, took her position in front of the door, and assessed it in about 4 seconds flat. Then he stepped back, brought his boot up, and kicked the door not at the handle, but at the lower hinge. The frame cracked. He kicked it again, and it swung inward on the upper hinge only, opening enough to reach through. He went in at a low angle, staying below the smoke, and came out dragging the crate by its rope handle in about 30 seconds. He went back in twice more. His coat was smoking by the third time, and she grabbed his arm and said, "That's enough," in her doctor's voice, not a request. And this time he listened. They stood back and watched the shed go. It went fast. The timber was dry, the wind was coming up the alley, and there wasn't enough water pressure at the street pump to do more than wet the clinic's exterior wall and keep the fire from spreading to the main building. By the time Briggs and 2 other men arrived with buckets, there wasn't much to save anyway. Abby stood in the alley with her 3 rescued crates and watched the shed collapse inward in a shower of orange sparks. Jed was standing a few feet away. His coat was ruined. He had a burn along his right forearm where the sleeve had ridden up going through the doorway. He was looking at it with the expression of a man cataloging damage, not one who was particularly bothered by it. "Let me see that," she said. He held out his arm without argument. She was starting to notice that he argued less when it was a genuine emergency. "You need to come somewhere with better light," she said, "and you need to tell me what you know about who did this." He looked at her for a moment. "My cabin," he said. "It's a ride up the ridge, but it's shelter, and I've got a lantern and clean water." She looked at the collapsed shed. She looked at the clinic building, which was intact. There was nothing else to do here tonight that 24 neighbors and a lot of anxious concern couldn't handle better than she could. "All right," she said. "Give me 5 minutes." The ride up the ridge took 40 minutes in the dark, Abby on the clinic's borrowed mare and Jed on his buckskin, with the temperature dropping steadily as they gained elevation. By the time they reached the cabin, The rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived, coming in from the northwest in heavy, sustained sheets that turned the pine canopy into a roaring percussion section overhead. The cabin was built into the rock face on the north side, which meant 3 of its walls were stone and the 4th was heavy timber. It was small and almost aggressively sparse inside. A table, 2 chairs, a rope bed with a wool blanket, a stone fireplace with a good iron grate, a rifle above the door, a row of hooks on the wall with various gear hung in particular order. No decoration of any kind, no softness anywhere. Jed got the fire going with the efficiency of someone who had done it in the dark before. Abby set her bag on the table and found the lantern and got it lit. Then she made him sit in one of the chairs, turned it toward the light, and looked at the burn on his arm properly. It was a 2nd-degree burn, maybe 4 inches along the outer forearm. Hot, already beginning to blister along the center. She cleaned it with the carbolic solution she kept in a small vial in her kit, which made Jed breathe through his nose but otherwise not react. And then she applied the burn salve and began wrapping it with clean linen. "You went back in 3 times," she said. "The 3rd time was the one you stopped. That's my point." Outside, the rain intensified. The fire was building behind the grate, and the small room began to warm. Jed was watching her work with the patient attention of someone who had learned that watching closely was more useful than most other things. "The lock was cut," he said. "Not broken. Cut with a good pair of shears. That's not an opportunist. That's someone who planned it." "Thorne was in my clinic this morning," she said. "I know." She looked up at him. "You were watching." "Somebody needed to be." She finished the wrapping and secured it with a knot. He rotated his forearm slowly, tested the give of the bandage, and nodded once. Approval, she had learned, was generally nonverbal with Jed O'Sullivan. She should have gotten back on the horse and ridden down to town. She knew that. The clinic building was intact, the fire was out, and there was nothing up here that she specifically needed. But the rain was now heavy enough that the trail down the ridge would be running mud in another hour. And she was tired in a way that had accumulated over days rather than just tonight, and Jed didn't suggest she leave. So she stayed. He made coffee over the fire, real coffee, which surprised her. And they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace while the storm worked itself up outside. The rain against the cabin roof was a constant low thunder. The fire cracked and popped. Between those sounds, the silence was the comfortable sort, which was not nothing in a room with a man. She had known less than 2 weeks. She had finished her coffee and was staring at the fire when she noticed his shirt. He had taken his coat off when they came in, and the warmth of the fire had him sitting forward with his forearms on his knees. The back of his shirt was not entirely opaque in the firelight, and beneath it, across the landscape of his shoulders and upper back, she could see not entirely but enough a topography of raised and linear scarring that didn't come from any single incident. He became aware of her awareness. She saw his shoulders draw together slightly, an almost unconscious closing. She didn't look away. "Those aren't from cattle work," she said quietly. A long pause. "No," she waited. The fire popped. Rain sheeted against the one small window. Jed looked at the fire for a while, and she let him take his time. "I was a scout," he said finally. "Army. 7 years, 3 campaigns." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The scars on the back were from the 2nd year. "We were running a supply detail through hostile territory, and I made a call that sent 6 men into a position I thought was clear." He stopped. It wasn't clear. How many came back? 2. His jaw was set, his eyes on the fire. "Including me." "That's the part that's hardest to sleep with. That I was one of the 2. Abby looked at him steadily. She had heard a version of this before, in different words, from different men who had survived things their friends hadn't, and she had learned that the wrong response was worse than no response at all. She didn't offer comfort or absolution, because that wasn't what this was. This was a man setting something down, carefully, in the presence of another person, to see if it could bear the weight. She moved her chair slightly closer. Not dramatically, just enough. She reached out and put her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, where she knew from the firelight the scars were densest. She felt him go still at the contact. Not rigid still, the difference being that rigid is a preparation for something, and still is an arrival somewhere. She kept her hand there. The ones who walked away from that position, she said, because of the call you made, they had families who got them back, people who would have lost them. She didn't soften her voice or sweeten it. She said it plain. That matters. It doesn't cancel the grief and it doesn't close the account, but it matters. He didn't say anything. You can carry the guilt and still let it be true. At the same time, she said. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Jed looked at the fire for another long moment. Something in the set of his shoulders changed not much, but she felt it under her hand. A slight release, like a knot that had been pulled one thread looser. The true strength of a man, she said quietly, isn't measured by how many enemies he cuts down. It's by how many lives he's willing to shelter. He turned his head and looked at her. She held his gaze. The firelight moved across his face, and the rain pressed against the cabin walls, and outside the storm had settled into the long, patient rhythm that meant it was going to be there all night. I've been watching your clinic, he said. His voice was low. Every night since you arrived. I know, she said. He turned back to the fire, but he didn't move away, and she kept her hand where it was. The coffee cups went cold. The fire burned lower, and she added 2 logs from the stack beside the grate without asking permission. Jed watched her do it and didn't say anything, which she was beginning to understand was his version of saying quite a lot. The storm outside raged on. The cabin held against it, the way things, built into rock, tend to hold without drama, without comment, simply by being what it was. She fell asleep in the chair with her legs tucked under her and her head tilted against the stone of the fireplace. She was aware enough, in the floating edge of sleep, to feel him put his coat over her before the last of the fire's peak warmth faded. She didn't say anything either. Some things didn't need words. The ledger was what she kept coming back to. Not the burns on Tomas's arms, though those were bad enough. Not the tremors in Mateo's hands that had gotten worse over the past 2 weeks, despite the change in water source. Not even the fact that 3 more workers had come to the clinic in 4 days. With the same cluster of symptoms, the pressure headaches, the pale nail beds, the cough that sat too deep and too still in the chest. It was the ledger, or rather, the absence of one. Every physician kept records. It was not optional. It was the foundation of medical practice, a running account of patients seen, treatments administered, outcomes observed. You built on what came before you. You referenced prior cases. You looked for patterns across time. It was how medicine learned anything at all. The previous physician in Blackwood had been Dr. Emmett Cray. She knew that much from the town registry. He had practiced here for 11 months before his abrupt departure 6 weeks ago, and in 11 months he would have generated a substantial amount of documentation, patient files, drug dispensary logs, correspondence with the Territorial Medical Board. There was none of it in the clinic, not a single page. She had asked about it on her 3rd day. The woman at the land registry office had shrugged and said, Dr. Cray left in a hurry. These things happened. Sheriff Cade, when she stopped by his office with the same question, had looked at a spot just past her left ear and said the same thing in different words. In a hurry. These things happen. She had written both conversations in her notebook. Jed listened to all of it from the other chair in the clinic after hours, the door locked and the lamp turned low. He had taken to coming by in the evenings in a quiet, unannounced way that had become a routine without either of them formally establishing it as one. He sat with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the middle distance, and he listened the way good scouts listen completely, without interrupting, processing. The records are in the quarry office, he said when she finished. Or they were. Thorne's men went through the clinic building the same week Cray disappeared. 2 of them. Middle of a Tuesday afternoon, bold as anything, while Maeve's woman was supposed to be airing the place out before you arrived. How do you know that? Because Maeve's woman told, and Maeve told me. He turned his hat in his hands. Thorne had the building cleaned out before you got here. Whatever Cray left, Thorne has it. Abby was quiet for a moment. Then we need to get into the quarry office, she said. Jed looked at her. He said. I need a medical professional to assess what those records contain and what they mean. That's me. She met his eyes. And I need someone who can get us in and out without getting shot. That's you. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might actually refuse. Then he said, Thursday. The night crew rotates at midnight, and there's a 20-minute window when the east side of the building is unwatched. Thursday, she said. Thursday arrived, with a storm front moving in from the northwest that turned the sky the color of a bruise by late afternoon. By 9 in the evening, the wind was up, and the first lightning was walking along the ridge lines to the west. By 11, when Abby slipped out the back of the clinic in dark clothes, with her bag stripped down to essentials, the rain was coming in sideways, and the main street of Blackwood was empty in both directions. Jed was waiting at the mouth of the alley with 2 horses. He looked at her, took in the dark coat, the flat-soled boots, the bag. He nodded once. That was all. They left the horses tied a quarter-mile from the quarry perimeter and covered the rest on foot, staying off the road and moving through the scrub pine along the creek drainage. Jed moved with absolute economy. No wasted steps, no hesitation at junctions, no noise beyond what the rain already covered. Abby focused on matching his pace and placing her feet where he placed his. The quarry processing plant was a collection of long timber buildings surrounding the mouth of the main shaft. The office was separate, a 2-story stone structure set back from the processing floor with barred lower windows and a heavy door. Light showed in one upper window. The rest was dark. Jed assessed the building from the tree line for a full 3 minutes without moving. Then he touched her elbow and they went. He took them around the east face, away from the lit window, moving close to the stone wall where the overhang kept the worst of the rain off. He produced a set of picks from his coat pocket at the side door and had the lock open in less than 2 minutes. Abby watched his hands work and thought, not for the first time, that Jed O'Sullivan had lived several different lives before the one she'd met him in. Inside was dark and smelled of damp paper and lamp oil, and the underlying mineral sharpness of the quarry itself, that particular alkaline bite that she had learned to associate with her sicker patients. She used a hooded lantern, keeping the beam narrow. Jed stayed at the door. The main office was a large room with a heavy desk and 3 filing cabinets and a long shelf of bound ledgers. She went to the ledgers first. They were labeled by year and quarter production figures. Payroll, material costs. She ran her finger along the spines and pulled the current year's volume and opened it on the desk production numbers. Nothing else. She tried the filing cabinets. The first 2 held contracts and land surveys and correspondence with the territorial governor's office that she noted but didn't have time to read in full. The 3rd cabinet was locked. She looked at it for a moment, then looked back at Jed. He came across the room without being asked, assessed the lock, and had it open in 40 seconds. Inside were 3 things: a bundle of correspondence tied with cord, a small leather case she didn't recognize, and a bound journal separate from the official ledgers with no label on the spine. She opened the journal. The handwriting was not Thorne's. It was smaller, more precise, with the particular form of a man trained in scientific notation abbreviations, dosage notations, symptom codes she recognized immediately because they were the same ones she had been taught. This was a physician's record. She turned to the first page. E. Cray, M.D., in the top corner. Below it, a date from 14 months ago, the beginning of his practice in Blackwood. She turned pages quickly, scanning, her eyes moving across Cray's careful entries. Patient numbers rather than names of precaution, she realized. as though he'd known from an early point that these records might be seen by someone who shouldn't see them. The symptoms he described were the same ones filling her own clinic. The same progression, the same timeline relative to placement in the lower tunnels. And on a page near the back, dated 8 weeks ago, a single paragraph in handwriting that had gotten less careful, more pressured, as though written in a hurry or under strain. She read it twice. She closed the journal. "Jed," she said. He was already looking at her. Something in her voice had changed and he heard it. "Cray didn't leave," she said. "He documented everything, the water contamination, the metal exposure, the full medical picture of what's happening to those workers. And then he went to Thorne with it." She looked at the journal in her hands. This last entry. "He documents a meeting with Thorne where he threatened to report the findings to the Territorial Medical Board if the practices didn't change within 30 days. Jed's face was very still. "That was 8 weeks ago," she said. The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. "Cray didn't abandon this town," Jed said. "No." She slid the journal into her bag. "He was murdered, and Thorne covered it up." She looked at the locked cabinet, at the space where the journal had been sitting. Sheriff Cade helped him. Cray's last entry mentions a conversation where Cade was present. Jed absorbed this without visible reaction, which was not the same as no reaction. She had learned the difference. "We need to move," he said. "I need 2 more minutes. There's correspondence." Abby, the way he said her name, stopped her. Not loud. Steady, she looked at him and saw that he was watching the upper staircase through the half-open office door with the focused attention of a man who has heard something she hasn't. She went still. Voices, above them, moving. 2 sets of boots on timber flooring, angling toward the stairs. She closed the filing cabinet as quietly as she could manage. Jed was already at her side, and he took her elbow and steered her toward the side door they'd come in through. Moving fast but not running. Made noise. Running also made the mind stupid, and Abby kept her head. They were through the side door and flat against the outer wall. When the light from an upper window swept across the yard, someone had a lantern up there, checking the perimeter. The beam crossed the ground 15 feet from where they stood and moved on. Jed's mouth was close to her ear. South fence, through the drainage ditch. Go, they went. A shout from behind them, not certain, more questioning. Someone had seen or heard something uncertain enough to need verification. Then a second shout, more definitive, and then the unmistakable metallic sequence of a rifle being levered. Jed drew his left revolver without breaking stride. He fired twice into the air, above the roofline, not at anyone, not toward the building, just into the darkness, and the twin cracks of it split the rainstorm and echoed off the quarry walls, and bought them approximately 6 seconds of confusion from the guards. 6 seconds was enough. They went through the drainage ditch at a scrambling run, came up the far side muddy to the knees, and hit the scrub pine at full speed. Jed caught a branch in the face and kept going. Abby's bag swung hard against her hip with every stride, and she held it with her free hand and kept the journal pressed against her body through the canvas. The horses were where they'd left them. Jed was up and had her reins passed across before she reached the stirrup. They rode north along the drainage for a 1/4 mile before cutting west into the tree line, and the shouts and the lamplight behind them got smaller and eventually disappeared behind the curve of the ridge. The storm swallowed them whole. They didn't speak until they were well up the ridge road, and the quarry lights were gone behind the tree line. The rain was relentless, cold, filling the ruts in the trail and turning the road into a slow brown river under the horses' hooves. Abby reached into her bag and confirmed the journal was still there, still dry, protected by the canvas. "Cade," she said, over the sound of the rain. "If we take this to him, we—" "Don't go to Cade," Jed said. "Not with this. Not yet." She thought about the way the sheriff had looked past her ear when she'd asked about Cray's records, the emptiness of that look, the careful, practiced blankness of a man who had arranged his face to show nothing and practiced it until it was automatic. No, she agreed. Not Cade. They rode in silence up through the rain and the dark pines toward the higher ground, carrying a dead man's evidence and the full weight of what it meant. The next 2 days moved fast. Abby made copies of Cray's key entries in her own hand, working at the clinic table by lamplight after her last patient of the day, her hand moving quickly and precisely. She was building a duplicate record, something that could survive if the journal itself was taken. She kept one copy in the clinic, hidden behind a false back panel she had constructed in the medicine cabinet. She gave the other copy to Jed, who disappeared it somewhere in the ridge cabin that she didn't ask about. Jed had his own work going in parallel. He spent those 2 days quietly, talking to people he trusted: a retired Army surveyor who knew territorial land law, an old freighter who had moved goods through Blackwood for a decade and had seen things pile up over time that individually meant nothing and collectively meant a great deal. He was building a different kind of record, the kind that didn't live on paper. On the second evening, he came by the clinic and told her what he'd found. 3 men from the lower tunnels had gone missing over the past year. Not all at once, one in spring, one in late summer, one in October. The official version, in each case, was that they had moved on, left for the California fields or the Nevada silver operations, or simply drifted the way workers drift. Their families were still in Blackwood. None of them had received a letter. Abby wrote it all down with her jaw set. "We need to get this to the Territorial Medical Board directly," she said. "Bypass the local chain entirely. If we can get a formal investigation opened, it'll take time," Jed said. "Weeks to get a response, longer to get anyone here. And the moment Thorne figures out what we have, his next move is against the people who can testify, Mateo and Tomas, the other workers. So we protect them while we work the formal channel," she said. "That's the plan," he agreed. "But we need to move on both things at once, and we need to do it before Thursday's shipment goes out." She looked at him. "What shipment?" "Thorne ships refined ore every 2 weeks by private wagon to the rail terminus at Carson Creek. This Thursday is a shipment day. But Mateo thinks the cargo isn't all ore. He thinks Thorne's been moving something else out on shipment days, documents, possibly. Records he wants out of reach." She thought about the correspondence bundle she hadn't had time to read in the quarry office. "Then we need something before Thursday," she said. They were still planning when the window at the front of the clinic went dark. Not dark from inside, dark from outside. Something passing in front of the lamplight from the street, slowly and then stopping. Jed was at the front wall in 3 steps, his Colt out, pressing himself to the timber beside the window. He looked through the edge of the glass without presenting himself in it. 2, he said quietly. "Across the street. One more at the alley mouth." Abby killed the lamp. She moved to her bag in the dark and pulled it over her shoulder by feel. The journal copy in the front pocket, her hand confirming the latch. "Back door," Jed said. They went out the back into the alley. The figure at the alley mouth was on the main street side, not watching the back, and they moved away from him through the darkness at a low crouch. Jed went first, and she kept one hand on his duster as a tether in the black. They came out onto the side street and kept going north, and by the time the shouting started behind them, they were around the second corner and moving for the horses at the livery. They rode hard out of Blackwood, with 3 riders behind them. Jed knew the roads in the dark better than the men following them, and he pushed north along the canyon road at a pace that was reckless in the rain, and necessary for exactly that reason. Abby stayed close behind him, her mare matching the buckskin's stride, leaning over the horse's neck. The road narrowed as it climbed. The canyon walls rose on both sides, wet and black, and the sound of the river below grew from a murmur to a roar as the gradient dropped away to the east. She could smell the floodwater before she could see it, that dark, rich, violent smell of a river that has taken on more than it was built to carry. Jed pulled up where the road ended. Not a planned stop, the road literally ended. A section of trail ahead had given way in the flooding. A 20-foot section of cliff edge sheared clean into the gorge, and where the road continued, on the other side it was separated from them by a gap that no horse was jumping in the dark. Behind them, on the road they'd come up, she could hear the approaching horses. She looked over the edge of the cliff. 50 feet down, the river was nothing she had vocabulary for. It was not a river in the ordinary sense. It was a moving geography, brown and massive, and loud enough that she felt it in her sternum, carrying trees and debris, and showing no interest in anything human. In the intermittent lightning, she could see the surface of it, churned white and muscular, filling the canyon wall to wall. 3 riders came around the bend and pulled up 20 yards back, not charging. They had somewhere to be, and they knew it. One of them had a rifle leveled across his saddle. End of the road, O'Sullivan. Jed's revolvers were out. He had them both at shoulder height, and his back was to the cliff edge. She counted. 3 rifles against 2 pistols, with the canyon at their backs. She ran the math without wanting to. Then a 4th rider came around the bend, and a 5th. She heard Jed exhale, once, slow and controlled. His weight shifted slightly, and she recognized the movement from the mountain pass on her first day. He was distributing his stance, calculating. She was already calculating something different. The river, the current direction, the distance down, and what that impact would mean at terminal velocity if you went in feet first with a strong push away from the cliff face. Her medical brain was running probabilities on survival without being asked to. The odds were not good. But the alternative was worse. Jed glanced at her. Just once, quickly, and in that glance was a question, and also an answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. The lead rider raised his rifle. Jed looked at her fully. His gray eyes were steady. The rain was coming down hard enough to run off the brim of his hat in a continuous sheet. "Do you trust me?" he said. There was no theater in it, no bravado. It was a straight question from a man who needed a straight answer. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. She nodded. He moved. His right revolver came up and fired twice in rapid sequence, not at the riders, at the lantern, hanging from the lead rider's saddle horn. It exploded in a shower of burning oil, and the horse screamed and reared, and the whole group fractured in the sudden chaos of fire and noise and panicked animals. In the same motion, Jed dropped the revolvers into his holsters, stepped to Abby, wrapped both arms around her, and stepped backward off the cliff. She had time for 1 breath. The world inverted. The 50 feet went faster than physics had any right to allow. She tucked her face against Jed's chest and felt his arms lock around her, and then the river hit them with a force that was not pain exactly. It was past pain, past any individual sensation. It was simply totality. The cold was absolute. The current grabbed them immediately, not gently, and the world became noise and dark water, and the violent, directionless tumble of a river that was moving faster than thought. She held onto Jed's coat with both fists and held her breath. Above them, muffled by the water and the distance they were already covering downstream, she heard the flat pop of rifle shots fired into the river. The current took them around the first bend, then the second. She couldn't see anything. She couldn't hear anything except the river. Her lungs were burning, and she focused on holding her breath, holding the coat, holding the one fixed point in a world that had become entirely fluid and extremely loud. Jed's arm found her waist in the dark water. He pulled her upward, and her face broke the surface, and she pulled in air cold and wet and absolutely necessary. And he was there, his head above water, his arm around her, keeping them both from going under. "Kick," he said. She kicked. He angled them toward the right bank with powerful strokes, fighting the current sideways rather than against it. The current fought back. It always does. But the river was beginning to widen slightly as the canyon walls fell back, and the current at the edges was slower than the center. And Jed knew how to read moving water. They hit the gravel bank in the dark, behind the curtain of a waterfall, where a side creek tumbled in over the canyon wall. It was a pocket maybe 20 feet wide, dry gravel above the waterline. A shallow cave, worn back into the rock by centuries of water. Abby crawled onto the gravel on her hands and knees and breathed. Jed came out of the water behind her. She heard him moving, heard the scrape of gravel, and then the sound of him going still. She turned over and sat up. He was on his back, on the gravel. His coat was still on, but hanging open. And on his left side, below the ribs, his shirt was dark with something that was not river water. It was too dark and too thick, and it spread slowly as she watched. The rifle shot she had heard before they hit the water. She was on her knees beside him before she was aware of moving. "Jed." "I know," he said. His voice was even but shallow. "I know." She had her bag. Somehow, against all probability, she had her bag. The strap had stayed across her body through all of it. She got it open and got the lantern out. Her hands were shaking from the cold, and she allowed them to shake while she struck the match, and once the lantern was lit, the shaking stopped. She looked at the wound. A rifle ball, lower left flank, entry wound, clean. She pressed her fingers around it, carefully, and Jed breathed out hard through his nose, but didn't make any other sound. She checked for the exit wound and didn't find one, still in there, which meant she was going to have to take it out. She looked around the cave. She looked at the waterfall, the gravel, the dark river beyond. She looked at Jed, who was looking at the cave ceiling, with the focused calm of a man deliberately choosing not to catastrophize. She had a pocket blade, 2 vials of carbolic, clean linen, her survival kit, and the small survival fire kit that she had added to her bag after the shed fire because she had decided then and there that it was a non-negotiable piece of equipment going forward. She was going to need all of it. "This is going to hurt," she said, "considerably more than a shoulder graze." "Do what you need to do," he said. She did. The fire took 3 attempts. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be, but the matches were damp from the river crossing, and the first 2 went out before they caught. The third one held. She cupped it with both palms and fed it pine needles from the dry upper shelf of the cave wall, and it grew slowly from a small orange point into something that actually produced heat. She needed the heat for 2 reasons. The first was the blade. She held the pocket knife over the flame until the steel glowed faintly orange at the tip, then pulled it back and let it cool to a dull red. Not scorching, just clean. Carbolic acid was for the wound before and after. The heat was for the blade itself, because fire destroyed what she couldn't see. The second reason was Jed. He had lost blood. Not catastrophically, the ball had missed the major vessels. She was almost certain of that, based on the rate of bleeding and the fact that he was still conscious and coherent, but he had lost enough that his core temperature was already dropping. And the river crossing had finished the job. The blood loss started. She could see the shivering in his arms and chest, even though he was trying not to show it. "Jed, look at me." He looked at her. "Count backwards from 50, she said. Out loud. "That's not necessary. It's not for you. It's so I can monitor your cognition while I work." She was opening the carbolic vial. 50. A pause. Then, flatly, 50. 49. 48. She worked. She had done extractions before. 3 times in her residency in Boston, twice on the frontier in the month before Blackwood. Each time was its own specific problem. This one was deep. The ball had traveled inward and slightly upward on an entry which told her the rifle had been fired from elevation, which fit with the cliff edge above them. She probed with the tip of the blade, and Jed's counting faltered at 31 and resumed at 30, his voice tighter but still going. She found the ball at approximately 2 inches depth, lodged against the lateral edge of the lowest left rib. No bone penetration. It had stopped short. She worked the tip of the blade around it carefully. Jed bit down on the pine branch she had given him, and his whole body went rigid, and she said, "Hold still," without looking up, and he held still, which was an act of will she didn't underestimate. The ball came free. She held it up to the lantern light, smaller than she'd expected. A pistol ball, not a rifle ball, which explained why it hadn't gone deeper. She cleaned the wound with carbolic, packed it with the linen she had boiled over the fire in the tin cup from her kit, and bound it tight. Her fingers moved from memory at that point. She had done the binding enough times that her hands knew the sequence without being told. She sat back. Jed lay still on the gravel with the pine branch in his fist and his eyes on the cave ceiling. His chest rose and fell. His color was bad gray pale where it should have been brown from sun, but his eyes were tracking and his breathing was steady. 47, 46, 45, he said, after a moment. You can stop counting. Good. He let out a slow breath. That was unpleasant. Yes, she said, it was. She looked around the cave. The fire was built well enough to maintain itself for a while. If she added wood every 20 minutes, and there was dry driftwood piled naturally against the back wall by old flood cycles, more than enough for the night. The waterfall at the entrance created a white noise that was both loud and strangely calming, and the gravel bank was dry above the current waterline. They were alive. They were out of the current. The wound was clean. Those were the facts. She organized herself around them. The next problem presented itself within the hour. The temperature in the cave dropped sharply as the night deepened. She had expected some drop. They were at elevation. The storm was still active outside, and the waterfall pulled cold air continuously through the cave mouth. She had not fully reckoned with how much the river crossing had taken from them both. Their clothing was wet through to the skin. Her coat, which had felt heavy and damp on the ride out of Blackwood, was now a cold compress wrapped around her body, pulling heat out instead of keeping it in. She stood up and felt the shivering hit her in a full wave. That was the real problem, not discomfort, physiology. A body losing core temperature loses blood pressure, loses coordination, loses the ability to think clearly, and eventually loses the argument entirely. She knew the progression clinically, and she was beginning to feel the early stages of it in her own limbs. Jed was further along. He hadn't said anything, but she could see it. The shivering that had started as occasional tremors was now sustained, and his hands were the white blue of tissue that wasn't getting enough circulation. She assessed the situation without sentiment. The fire was small, and the cave was large, and they were wet. In those conditions, external heat was supplementary at best. The most effective way to prevent lethal hypothermia with available resources was direct body heat transfer, shared warmth under insulation, skin against skin, two heat sources combining. She knew this the same way she knew any other medical fact, without embarrassment and without hesitation. It was true whether it was convenient or not. She went to the back of the cave, where the dry driftwood was stacked and found, wedged behind it, a section of canvas tarp old, stiff with dried mud, but intact. River debris, probably, left from a previous flood season. She shook it out and checked it, and it was dry on the inner fold. She came back to the fire. "I need you to listen to me," she said. Jed looked at her. His gray eyes were still sharp, which was something. "Your core temperature is dropping. Mine is too. The fire isn't enough. We need to share heat." She held up the canvas. "I'm going to strip our wet clothing off and wrap us both in this. It's a medical necessity, not a negotiation." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She helped him sit up first and got his coat off, then the shirt, working around the wound binding without disturbing it. She turned away while he managed the lower half himself, listening for the sounds that told her he was done, and moving carefully, which he was. She undressed with her back to him. Fast and practical. She had long since made peace with her body as a functional instrument rather than a source of social complexity, and she applied the same thinking here. She draped their wet clothes over the rocks nearest the fire to dry and spread the canvas on the gravel. She lay down beside him and pulled the canvas over them both. The first sensation was cold. His skin was cold against hers, and she was cold against his. And for a moment it was simply two cold things pressed together in a cold cave. She didn't flinch from it. She pressed her back against his chest and pulled his arm around her and tucked the canvas in at the edges. He was shivering. She was shivering. The fire popped and threw orange light across the cave walls. Then, slowly the shared heat began to build. It was not immediate. Biology works on its own schedule. But it worked. His shivering slowed by degrees over the next 20 minutes, and she felt her own core warmth returning first in her chest, then spreading outward to her limbs. His arm around her gradually lost its rigidity. His breathing deepened and evened out. She watched the fire. She was aware of him with a precision that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the simple fact that she was a person and he was a person, and they were lying together in a cave, with the waterfall speaking its white noise outside, and the storm working itself through somewhere above the canyon walls. His heartbeat, she could feel it against her back, strong and steady even now. His hand, which had settled at her waist, because that was where it had landed. When she pulled his arm around her, was still there. His palm was warm now. The warmth moved through her. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. But somewhere in the space between surviving and sleeping, something shifted. It was not dramatic. It was more like the moment when you've been holding a difficult posture for a long time, and your muscles finally release not a collapse, just a letting go. His arm drew her marginally closer. She let it. She settled marginally back into the warmth of him. The cave was quiet except for the fire and the water. She added wood once, carefully, without breaking the shared warmth more than necessary. Jed's breathing told her he was half asleep, which was the best possible thing for him right now. She let him drift. Outside the waterfall, the river ran its crimson-brown flood through the darkness of Devil's Canyon, and the storm moved slowly east. And inside the cave, two people lay together on gravel and canvas and built warmth out of necessity, and let necessity become something else without naming it. She stayed awake a long time, watching the fire. She didn't mind. She woke in darkness with the fire burned to deep orange coals. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she heard the waterfall, felt the gravel through the canvas, felt the warmth behind her, and remembered everything in sequence. The wound, the ball, the canvas, the cold, and what they had done about it. Jed was awake. She knew before she turned his breathing had the particular quality of a man lying still and thinking, not sleeping. She turned over within the circle of his arm and found his eyes open, looking at the cave ceiling. "How's the pain?" she said. "Manageable." She reached for the lantern, and he stopped her with a light touch on her wrist. Not forceful, just there. She looked at him. The coal light moved across his face, the angle of his jaw, the gray eyes, which were not distant the way they usually were. They were close, fully present and fully on her. He had a way of looking that she was still learning how to handle. Most people looked and then moved their eyes to something else. Jed looked and stayed there, steady and unhurried, as though he had decided this was where his attention belonged, and had no particular reason to change his mind. "Abby," he said. Just that. She had heard her name 1,000 times. From professors who doubted her, from patients who needed her, from colleagues who respected her, and a few who didn't. It had never sounded precisely like this. Her name in his voice, in this cave, in this dark, was a different object than it had been anywhere else. She didn't answer with words. She moved her hand and set it against the side of his face. His jaw was rough with 2 days of growth and warm under her palm. She felt the muscle there flex slightly at her touch. He shifted onto his side, slow and careful, managing the wound. Then his hand came up and settled at the curve of her neck, his thumb at her jaw, and he looked at her for one more moment, with that complete, unhurried attention. Then he kissed her, not cautiously. Jed O'Sullivan did not appear to own caution in any meaningful quantity. He kissed her with the full intention of a man who had thought about it and decided, and his mouth was warm and certain, and she felt the decision of it move through her, like the first real heat after a long cold. She kissed him back. His hand moved from her jaw into her hair, and she pressed closer, and the canvas fell back, and neither of them reached to fix it. The fire had warmed the cave enough. The warmth now was coming from other sources. He pulled back just enough to look at her again, close enough that she could feel his breath. "You've been in my head since that first road," he said. His voice was low, private. Every day since, she thought about saying something practical, something that maintained the rational frame she usually kept around herself like a well-organized medical kit. She didn't. "I know," she said instead, and she did know, because she had been managing the same problem from her side of it and not managing it particularly well. He pressed her back against the smooth stone of the cave wall, not roughly, deliberately. His hands knew where they were going and went there with the same precision he applied to everything else. His mouth moved from hers to her throat, following the line of her neck downward, hot against her skin, and she tilted her head back against the stone and felt the warmth of it spread in both directions. His mouth reached her collarbone and stayed there. She had her hands in his hair. She could feel the hard muscle of his shoulders under her palms, the topography of his scars familiar now from that night by the fireplace. And they didn't feel like damage from here. They felt like geography. The landscape of a man who had survived a great many things and stood in front of her anyway. He lifted his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark. That particular gray had deepened to something that had no color name. "Tell me to stop," he said, "and I stop." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to tell you that." Something moved across his face, raw and unguarded in a way that his face almost never was. He lifted her hips, and she felt the full weight and warmth of him. And then he pressed forward into her, and the sudden overwhelming intensity of it took her breath in a gasp that echoed off the cave walls. He was still. His forehead dropped against hers, his breath heavy against her cheek, and he held himself still with a control that she could feel cost him something. She trembled. The sharp sting of physical stretch wound through her in waves, layered, over and under a surging, building warmth that was nothing like the clinical terms she knew for it. Those terms were accurate, and they were also completely insufficient. She dug her nails into the scarred muscle of his shoulders. "It hurts," she breathed. "Don't go deeper." She trembled as she said it, not from cold, not from fear, but from the sheer concentrated weight of sensation from being this close to another person in every possible sense of that phrase. He froze, one fraction of a second, completely still, his heavy breath hot against her ear, his gray eyes dark with raw need, and something far steadier underneath it found hers. He gripped her waist with both hands, firm, deliberate, controlling the pace with the same precision he controlled everything that mattered to him. He drew her flush against his chest. Every point of contact between them was heat. "You drive me out of my mind," he growled, low and private, directly against her ear. Then he moved, slow, deliberate, a cadence that began at the edge of bearable and built by degrees, as methodical and patient as everything else he did. And the sharp sting that had been the whole world a moment ago began to soften and spread and transform into something else entirely. The pain didn't vanish. It braided into something larger than itself. It became part of the whole frequency of the thing, inseparable from the warmth and the pressure and the rhythm he was building. Her legs locked around his lower back. She felt the depth of him completely, and her breath came out ragged. He watched her face as he moved, not performing, reading, adjusting. The rhythm found its pace, and then it built, and the cave walls were close around them, and the coals threw red light across his shoulders and his back, and she watched the play of shadow and firelight across the landscape of his scars, and felt him breathing her name against her throat. She surrendered to it. That was the only word that fit. Not defeat, surrender. The active choice to stop managing the situation and simply exist inside it, which was harder than it sounded for a woman who had spent her entire adult life being the person who managed things. She let go. The rhythm drove deeper, and the warmth built past the point of individual sensation and became total. and she heard her own voice in the cave, and didn't recognize it ragged and unguarded, mixed with the sound of his breathing, with the waterfall outside, with the fire's quiet percussion behind them. His grip on her tightened. His rhythm broke from its deliberate cadence into something more urgent, more instinctive, and she rose to meet it without thinking, because her body had stopped waiting for her mind to approve things. The climax, when it came, was shattering in the literal sense. It broke apart every organized structure she had constructed and scattered the pieces, and for one suspended moment she was nothing but sensation and warmth, and the sound of his voice saying her name, like it, meant something he didn't have other words for. She felt him reach the same place. The sound he made was low and private and real. Then they were still. The cave settled around them. The waterfall ran on. The coals breathed orange in the dark. Outside, somewhere high above the canyon walls, the storm was finally easing. He didn't move away. He stayed close, his arm drawing her in, and she let herself be drawn. Her head came to rest against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat again, the way she had in the night, but different now, faster, and gradually slowing, the way a river settles after the peak of a flood has passed. She breathed. Her whole medical vocabulary had nothing useful to offer her. She set it aside. "Your wound," she said eventually. "Still there," he said. A pause. "Worth it." She laughed. It surprised her. The laugh came up without warning, and she felt it move through her chest into his. She felt him smile against the top of her head. She had never seen Jed O'Sullivan smile with his full face, but she felt it now, and it was different from what she would have predicted. Less guarded, younger. Somehow she reached up and set her palm against his jaw. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm once, simple and deliberate. Outside, the rain quieted to a murmur. The river ran on below, lower now than it had been at the height of the flood, beginning its slow return to itself. She thought about Cray's journal in her bag, about Thorne and the ledgers and the missing men and the workers with the tremors in their hands. She thought about Mateo and Tomas, and the boy with the canvas apron who'd held his chin up in the yard. It was all still there. It was all still true and urgent and not finished. But right now, she was alive in a cave behind a waterfall with a man who had jumped off a cliff with her in his arms and then called her back from hypothermia with the warmth of his body. And the work would still be there in the morning. It would always be there in the morning. She closed her eyes. "Sleep," he said quietly. She did. They followed the river south at dawn. The storm had passed in the night and left the canyon washed clean and cold, the air carrying that particular post-rain clarity that makes distances look shorter than they are. The river was still running brown and swollen, but it had pulled back from its flood peak, and the gravel banks were wide enough to walk on. Jed moved carefully. Abby watched him without appearing to watch him, reading his gait, the way she read a patient's posture, the slight forward lean that compensated for the wound's location, the controlled breath that told her he was managing the pain rather than ignoring it. He was upright and functional. She would take that. Their clothes had dried passably overnight from the fire, stiff with mineral residue from the river, but dry enough. She had redressed the wound at first light with the last of her clean linen. The entry point looked clean, no heat signature around the edges, no discharge. She had told him so in clinical terms, and he had said good and pulled his shirt back on. They didn't talk much on the walkout. There was a great deal to say, and no urgency to say it immediately. That was something she had come to understand about Jed. He was comfortable with silence in a way that didn't mean absence. He was present in it. She had started to be present in it, too. They came out of the canyon mouth 2 hours after sunrise and picked up a road that Jed said take them to Mrs. Maeve's homestead by mid-morning. "You trust her?" Abby said. "Not a question." "As much as I trust anyone," he said. "More than most." That was about as strong an endorsement as Jed O'Sullivan gave. Mrs. Maeve's place sat at the end of a long, pine-shaded track, set back from the road far enough to be invisible from it. A solid stone house, 2 outbuildings, a kitchen garden behind a split-rail fence, and a yard that was swept clean and purposeful. 3 horses in the paddock. Smoke from the chimney. The woman who came to the door when they knocked was somewhere between 60 and 70, with white hair pinned severely back and eyes the color of creek, flint pale gray-green, and extremely sharp. She took in Jed's damaged coat and Abby's state, and the way Jed was holding his left side and said nothing for approximately 2 seconds. Then she pushed the door open. "Wider in," she said. That was Mrs. Maeve. She fed them first. It was not negotiable. Hot coffee and cornbread and salt pork, set on the table with the efficiency of a woman who had fed people in various states of emergency for several decades and knew that a person who hasn't eaten cannot think usefully. Abby ate 2 portions without apology. Jed ate 3. While they ate, they talked. Maeve sat at the end of the table with her own coffee and listened to all of it without interrupting the quarry office. Cray's journal, the cliff, the river, the cave. She listened the way very experienced people listen, which is to say, completely and without visible reaction, because the reaction comes later, after the information has been properly sorted. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something. Both of you, and you're not going to like it." Abby set down her coffee cup. "The people in Blackwood," Maeve said, "the workers, the townspeople who've been keeping their heads down and their mouths shut while Thorne does what he does." She paused. "You've been thinking they're frightened into passivity, that they've given up, haven't they?" Abby said. "No." Maeve's eyes moved between them. "They haven't. Thorne's been holding their families, not as a figure of speech, literally." She folded her hands on the table. "There's an outpost. Old relay station about 12 miles east in the high meadow. Thorne's been using it for 4 months. He has men stationed there with a rotation schedule, and he's been moving people, their wives, children, elderly parents, quietly, 1 or 2 at a time, telling the workers it's temporary housing, while their quarters are being improved." She let that sit for a moment. "It's not temporary housing." The kitchen was very quiet. "They're hostages," Jed said. "They're hostages," Maeve confirmed, "and every worker in Blackwood knows it, and not one of them will move against Thorne while their families are sitting in that outpost with armed men around them." She looked at Jed. "That's the silence you've been reading as cowardice." "It isn't." Abby thought about Mateo's careful word choices, the deliberate, measured way he spoke, choosing each word like a man navigating a minefield. The way his eyes moved to the door when she asked him questions about the foreman. She thought about the boy in the canvas apron who had held his chin up. His family was 12 miles east. "How many people at the outpost?" Jed said. 32 people being held, 7 armed guards on rotation." Maeve's voice was even. "And before you start planning how to go in alone, I'll save you the trouble of me having to argue you out of it." Jed looked at her. "You go in alone and you get the hostages out," Maeve said. "And then what?" "The workers still have nothing. They've been beaten down for months, their families held over them like a blade. You ride in, rescue everyone, and then leave them standing in a field with no tools, no legal standing, and a very angry baron who still controls the town's economy and the sheriff's office." She shook her head once. "That's not liberation. That's a temporary inconvenience for Thorne." "Then what are you saying?" Abby said. "I'm saying the workers need to do this themselves, with support, with someone standing beside them, not in front of them." Maeve looked at her. "They need to choose their own freedom, not have it handed to them like a gift that can be taken back." Abby was quiet for a moment. "She's right," she said. Jed looked at her. "Maeve is right," Abby said again. "If we extract the hostages and neutralize the threat and hand the workers a result, we've solved their immediate problem and left them exactly as powerless as before. Thorne or the next man like him moves in, and the cycle starts over." She looked at the table. "The workers have to be part of this. They have to stand up. Not because it makes a better story, because it's the only ending that actually holds." Jed was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the part of him that was a soldier, trained to identify the most direct line between problem and solution, arguing with the part of him that had lived long enough to know that the most direct line is not always the right one. He pushed back from the table and stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the paddock for a moment. Then he turned around. "We need a meeting," he said. "Tonight, somewhere Thorne's people won't know about. Get word to Mateo and the others." He looked at Maeve. "Can you do that?" "Already thinking about who to send," she said. By nightfall, 14 people were gathered in Maeve's main room. Mateo was there, and 4 other quarry workers whose faces Abby recognized from her clinic. 3 ranchers who had been squeezed by Thorne's land acquisition practices. A school teacher whose salary Thorne's company had been controlling through a local education board that Thorne himself had appointed. A woman who ran the boarding house and had been feeding Thorne's private militia at prices she hadn't been given a choice about. They all knew each other. They had been living in the same town, carrying the same weight, and not talking about it. Until tonight, Jed laid it out plain. The hostages at the outpost, the evidence in Cray's journal, the water contamination, the missing men. He didn't soften any of it. These were people who already knew the shape of the thing they were living in. He was just saying it out loud in a room where everyone could hear it at the same time. Then he opened the crate Maeve had brought from the back storage room. Rifles. A dozen of them, old but clean, maintained. He began setting them on the table one by one. "This gun doesn't make you a killer," he said. His voice was level and clear, and it carried to every corner of the room. "It's a reminder that no man has the right to trample your dignity or tear apart your..." Today, we take back our humanity. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Mateo reached out and picked up one of the rifles. He held it with the deliberateness of a man who had made a decision and was done with the making of it. One by one, the others followed. Abby watched it happen. She thought about Cray, who had written his careful records and tried to do this alone and hadn't come back. She thought about the boy in the canvas apron. She thought about the water running brown through the lower tunnels while men breathed it in day after day. She picked up her bag and began laying out what she had brought. "While you handle the outpost," she said, "I need 3 of you who know the quarry processing floor. There are compounds in that plant that can be combined to produce smoke and incapacitating vapor. I'm going to tell you exactly what they are and where they're stored and what to do with them." She looked around the room. "We're going to take Thorne's militia apart from the inside, and we're going to do it without killing anyone we don't have to." The school teacher raised her hand. "I know the processing floor. I've tutored the shift supervisor's children for 2 years. Abby looked at her. "Good. Sit here, please." They planned through the night. Dawn came gray and windless. It was the hour before the day shift rotation at the quarry, the 20-minute gap Jed had identified during his surveillance when the night crew was pulling out and the day crew hadn't yet organized. The gates would be moving. Attention would be divided. The private militia that Thorne kept on the processing floor would be at shift change, clustered around the guardhouse at the south entrance. Jed moved through the scrub pine above the quarry's north perimeter, with 8 of the ranchers and workers behind him. They moved in 2 columns, 4 and 4, with 30 yards between the groups. Nobody spoke. The ground was still soft from the rain, and their footsteps were quiet in the wet pine needles. He had the timing in his head like a map. 4 minutes to the north fence, 6 minutes from there to the machinery hall entrance. The 2-pronged assault he'd planned used the topography of the quarry itself. The processing plant sat between the shaft entrance and the ore storage yard, which meant Thorne's militia couldn't concentrate at any single point without leaving another point open. He thought about Abby. He did that deliberately, briefly, and then put it away. She was at the south approach with Mateo and the school teacher and her chemical compounds. She was the most capable person he knew, and she was doing her part, and he needed to be doing his. He focused on the fence line. The north perimeter was timber posts and wire, maintained enough to keep equipment in, but not built to stop determined men. Jed cut the wire at the third post from the corner with the cutters from Maeve's tool shed and pulled the section back without a sound. He went through first and held it for the men behind him. 8 men through a fence in 40 seconds. He had hoped for 30. They moved across the ore yard in the gray pre-dawn light, keeping to the shadows of the ore wagons stacked along the yard's eastern wall. The machinery hall was ahead of them, a long timber building with a corrugated iron roof. The rhythmic clanking of the stamp mills already starting up inside as the day crew began its warm-up. That noise was useful. It covered a great deal. The south approach was Abby's problem, and she was already handling it. She had come at the south entrance from the creek drainage with Mateo and Rosa, the schoolteacher, and 2 workers who knew the chemical storage room inside the processing plant. The south guardhouse had 4 men in it at shift change, and she didn't need them incapacitated immediately. She needed them distracted. Rosa walked up to the guardhouse gate alone, in her school clothes, carrying a basket. The guard who came to the gate looked at her with irritation. Processing floors not open to. I know that, Rosa said pleasantly. I've brought breakfast for the Hendricks family's delivery driver. He's been working overnight, and his wife asked me to make sure he ate something. She lifted the cloth on the basket. Cornbread, still warm. The guard looked at the cornbread. Rosa had correctly assessed that men who had been on overnight watch were not going to spend energy being suspicious of cornbread. While the guard reached for a piece, Mateo and the 2 workers went over the south fence wall at the creek side, 12 yards to the left, in 6 seconds. Abby came over behind them. She was inside the processing plant's south door in less than 3 minutes from the fence. The chemical storage room was exactly where Rosa had said. It would be second door on the left past the ore washers, marked with a yellow painted cross that meant hazardous materials, and a padlock that one of the workers had a key for. He'd had the key for 2 years. He had never used it this way before. She assessed the storage room quickly, moving through it with her lantern, reading labels. Mining operations used a standard set of compounds for ore processing. She knew the chemistry. She had read everything she could find on mineral extraction during her medical research into the workers' symptoms, and that research had a useful secondary application right now. Sulfur dust in quantity. Ammonium carbonate used for the ore flotation process. Carbon black, sawdust in the adjacent room. She began selecting and measuring with the calm efficiency of someone compounding a prescription. On the quarry floor, Thorne's private militia, 12 men total, armed and paid considerably better than the sheriff's deputies, had just completed its shift change when the first smoke canister went off. It went off at the north end of the machinery hall, a fat column of black smoke rolling upward from behind the stamp mills, thick and fast, with an acrid chemical smell that sent immediate alarm through everyone in the building. 2 of the militia broke toward it at a run. The second canister went off at the south end 30 seconds later. The militia split. 6 north, 4 south, 2 remaining in the center of the hall, and looking at each other with the expression of men realizing they've been maneuvered, and not yet knowing. By whom? Those 2 were the ones Jed's people came through the north door to meet. It was not a long engagement. Jed had 8 men against 2, and the 8 men had the advantage of purpose. They knew what they were doing and why, and Thorne's 2 guards knew only that something had gone wrong and the smoke was everywhere, and the visibility inside the machinery hall was dropping fast. The north group folded in 6 minutes. The south group took longer. 4 against 4, with better sight lines and a barricaded position behind the ore wagons. Jed moved around the perimeter of the hall in the smoke, navigating by the sound of the exchange, and came at the south group from the east side, with 2 of the ranchers, while Mateo held their attention from the front. One of Thorne's men tried to run for the executive building. Jed cut him off at the machinery hall door, And it was a brief and decisive exchange that left the man sitting on the ground, holding his jaw and watching his rifle, go in a different direction. The rest surrendered by degrees. Thorne had heard the first canister from his office on the second floor of the executive building. He had heard it with the specific alertness of a man who has spent years making enemies and has always half expected this moment. He came to the window and looked at the smoke rising from the machinery hall and made the calculation that Jed knew he would make. He went for the safe room. It was in the basement of the executive building Jed had learned about it from the freighter who had made deliveries there for a decade and had seen the door once when the basement flooded and Thorne's men were pumping it out. Stone walls, iron door, built into the foundation. Thorne had papers in there, money, probably a weapon or two. Jed was at the executive building's front door before Thorne made it to the basement stairs. The confrontation happened in the entrance hall. Thorne came around the corner of the staircase with a Remington pistol in his right hand and found Jed standing in the entrance with both revolvers out. For one moment, they stood looking at each other in the dust and smoke-filtered light, and Thorne's polished, manufactured composure finally showed what was underneath it. Fear. Clean and simple and human. "It's over," Jed said. "You have no legal authority. I have a dead doctor's journal and 32 witnesses who've been held at gunpoint for 4 months," Jed said, "and a territorial medical board that's going to get every page of it." He didn't move the revolvers, and he didn't raise his voice. "Set it down." Thorne's jaw tightened. He was doing the math. The same math men like him always do, looking for the angle, the leverage, the deal. There wasn't one. He set the Remington on the floor. The workers Jed had led came through the door behind him. Mateo was first. He looked at Thorne for a long moment with an expression that contained a great deal that he chose with visible effort, not to express physically. Then he picked up the Remington from the floor and held it at his side. Outside, a pistol shot sounded from the direction of the ore storage yard, the prearranged signal from the rancher's second group. The yard was secured. Inside the machinery hall, the smoke was already thinning. Abby had formulated it to disperse quickly. Once the ventilation was open, she had Rosa to open the ventilation panels on the hall's east wall the moment the canisters were down, and the morning air was moving through now. Jed looked at Thorne. He thought about Cray, about the workers' families in a relay station 12 miles east, about the boy in the canvas apron. "Tie him," he said. Mateo was already moving. The hostages at the relay station came home by mid-afternoon. The rancher's third group, 8 riders under the oldest of the 3 ranchers, a man named Creedy, who had been fighting for this valley since before Thorne arrived, had ridden east at dawn, time to arrive at the outpost when the quarry action began and Thorne's communication lines were cut. 7 guards against 8 armed ranchers with the advantage of surprise was not a complicated engagement. Nobody died. The guards surrendered and were bound, and the hostages came out blinking into the afternoon light. Mateo's wife was in that group, Tomas's mother, the schoolteacher's sister, 32 people who walked out of that relay station and onto the road home. Abby was at the quarry gate when the wagons came back with them. She helped the elderly down from the wagon beds and checked the children and noted what 3.5 months of inadequate food had done and began making lists in her head of what she needed from the clinic. She was working through the third wagon's passengers when Mateo found her. He stood in front of her and said nothing for a moment. His wife was beside him, a small, straight-backed woman with dark eyes who was holding her husband's arm with both hands. "Thank you," Mateo said. Abby looked at him. "You picked up the rifle," she said. "You all did because you showed us it was possible. You already knew it was possible," she said. "You just needed a room where you could say it out loud." He thought about that. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. Sheriff Cade arrived at the quarry at 3 in the afternoon with 2 deputies, having received a formal written notice that Abby had sent that morning via the stage driver. The only person in Blackwood, she was certain, Thorne didn't control because the man was aggressively apolitical and cared only about his schedule. Cade looked at Thorne tied to a chair in the executive building's entrance hall. He looked at the documentation spread across Thorne's desk, Cray's journal, Abby's copies, the correspondence bundle, the hostage ledger they'd found in the safe room, which was now open and considerably lighter than Thorne had intended. He looked at Jed. Then he looked at the 14 people standing in that room, several of whom were armed, and all of whom were watching him with a clarity of purpose that left very little room for his usual maneuvers. He made the only calculation available to him. "I'll need all of that for the territorial inquiry," he said, gesturing at the documentation. "You'll get certified copies," Abby said from the corner. "The originals are already on their way to the Territorial Medical Board by private rider." She had sent them that morning with the same stage driver who'd carried the notice to Cade, along with a full account of your role in Dr. Cray's disappearance. Cade looked at her. "You'll want to have a conversation with a lawyer," she said pleasantly, "before you talk to anyone from the territorial government." He left without arresting anyone, which was all she had needed from him today. Spring came to Blackwood Valley the way it always does in high country. Not all at once. First, the south-facing slopes went green, while the north faces still held their dirty snow. Then the creek ran clear and fast and cold with snowmelt, and the meadow grass came up through the mud in the low places. And one morning, Abby opened the clinic door, and the air smelled like pine and wet earth, and something flowering she couldn't immediately identify. She stood on the clinic porch for a full minute, just breathing it. The territorial inquiry had taken 6 weeks. It arrived in the form of 3 officials from the capital, a medical inspector, a land registrar, and a territorial judge whose manner suggested he had seen a great deal and retained the ability to be surprised. They read everything. They interviewed everyone. They went to the relay station and documented it, and went to the lower tunnels and documented that too. The medical inspector had spent an entire afternoon with Abby's records, turning pages and asking precise questions, and at the end of the afternoon he had looked at her across the table and said that her documentation was the most thorough field record he had encountered in 11 years of territorial medical work. She had thanked him and gone back to the clinic because there were still patients waiting. Thorne was in territorial custody, held at the Capitol, pending formal charges that had grown considerably longer than his lawyers had apparently anticipated. The correspondence bundle from the safe room had revealed arrangements with 2 other territorial officials that the judge seemed particularly interested in. Sheriff Cade had indeed spoken to a lawyer, and then had a rather extended conversation with the territorial authorities that resulted in his badge going to his deputy, a young man named Hobart, who had always been uncomfortable taking orders that didn't sit right, and now had the opportunity to take different ones. The quarry had not closed. That was the part that had required the most careful work, and Mateo had done most of it. The workers had organized through the winter, meeting at Maeve's homestead on Sunday afternoons, while the territorial process worked itself out, building the structure of something that didn't have a common template in this part of the country yet. A cooperative, equal shares among the working members, an elected safety board with actual authority, fair wages based on production rather than on what a single owner decided he felt like paying. The territorial land registrar had helped them file the formal documents. She had turned out to be a small, methodical woman from Ohio who had opinions about cooperative land law and an impressive amount of patience for paperwork. The lower tunnels were sealed pending a full environmental remediation that Abby had outlined in a formal medical report. The upper shafts operated under the new safety protocols. Mateo chaired the safety board. Tomas, whose tremors had improved significantly over the winter, with clean water and proper nutrition, kept the minutes. The new building had been Jed's idea, or rather, it had been everyone's idea. And Jed was the one who had said it out loud at the right moment at a Sunday meeting in late February, when the question of what to do with Thorne's confiscated executive building had produced more opinions than the room could comfortably contain. Tear it down, he had said simply, and build something the valley actually needs. There had been a pause. Two things, Abby had said from across the table. A school and a clinic, same building, connected. Nobody had argued. Construction had started in March. The whole valley had shown up for the frame, raising workers and ranchers, and the boarding house woman, and Rosa the school teacher, and Maeve's people, from the Homestead families, from the surrounding draws, who had been watching Blackwood from a careful distance and had started moving closer. Once the shape of things became clear, it was finished now. Jed was on the roof in the early morning light, driving the last nails into the sign above the main entrance. The wood was fresh-milled pine, still pale and fragrant, and the letters had been cut by the farrier, who turned out to have a precise hand with a chisel. Blackwood Valley School and Clinic. He set the last nail and drove it flush and straightened up. The valley spread out below him in the spring light, green in every direction. The meadow grass coming in thick in the low places, and the pines dark on the ridge lines, and the creek catching the morning sun in long silver flashes. Children were already in the yard below. The early arrivals for Rosa's first official school day, chasing each other around the new fence posts with the complete physical abandon of children who have been cooped up through a long winter. Immigrant children and valley children, running together in the same dust. He stood on the roof for a moment and looked at it. He had been in a lot of places, a lot of territories, a lot of towns, a lot of situations that had seemed important at the time and faded quickly in the rear view. He tried to locate what this felt like by comparison, and found that it didn't compare to anything. It was its own category. He climbed down the roof ladder. Abby was standing on the porch when he reached the ground. She had a glass of water in each hand and held one out to him without a word. He took it and drank. She leaned to the porch post and looked out across the green fields. She had filled out over the winter. Not dramatically. She was still lean and straight-backed and moved with the purposeful efficiency she had brought off that first stagecoach. But the drawn, driven intensity of those first weeks had softened at the edges. She looked rested. She looked like a person who had found the place she was supposed to be and had stopped holding her breath about whether it would hold. He stood beside her. Below in the yard, one of Mateo's nephews had found a stick and was apparently conducting a military operation against a fence post. Tomas's youngest sister was trying to teach three other girls a hand-clapping game with rules that seemed to change every 30 seconds. The arguing about the rules was louder than the game. The clinic has 16 appointments scheduled for today, Abby said. Rosa has 22 children enrolled. She's going to need a second teacher by fall. I heard the woman from the land registrar's office is thinking about staying, Jed said. Abby looked at him. You hear things. I pay attention, you do, she agreed. He turned and looked at her. There was a thing he'd been carrying since the cave. Not a problem, not an unresolved issue. More like a question he'd been waiting for the right moment to put into words. And he was increasingly aware that he was choosing to wait rather than being actually prevented from speaking, and that the distinction meant he should probably stop waiting. Abby, he said. She was already looking at him. Those clear, direct eyes that had assessed his shoulder wound on a wagon bed in the rain and found him measurable and manageable and treated him like a person rather than an obstacle or a legend. I'm not a man who makes speeches, he said. I know that, and I don't generally put a lot of stock in declarations when actions are available. Also true. But you should know, he said, that I've been in this valley 3 years and I stayed because the land suited me and I had no particular reason to leave. That's not why I'm staying now. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that steady look. Why are you staying now? She said. You know why, he said. I know, she said. I wanted to hear you say it anyway. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped off the porch and reached for her, and she came to him without any theatrical pause or hesitation, which was entirely consistent with who she was, and he put his arms around her and pulled her in and kissed her. In the full morning light, with the green valley behind her, and the children's voices in the yard, and the fresh pine smell of the new sign above them, she kissed him back. She had her hands against his chest. He could feel her laughing slightly against his mouth, not at the moment, but inside it, the way a person laughs when something is exactly right. He drew back and looked at her. "The frontier's different now," she said quietly. Not to him specifically. To the valley, to the children in the yard, to the new building behind them, and the clean water running in the creek, and the safety boards posted notice on the quarry gate, and Tomas's steady hands taking minutes at the Sunday meetings. "Yeah," Jed said. "It is." They stood together on the porch of the Blackwood Valley School and Clinic in the warm western sun, looking out at the green fields where children ran without distinction of origin or name or the color of their father's skin. And neither of them said anything else for a while. Some things had been built here that gun barrels hadn't built, and money hadn't built, and no single person's will had built. It had been built by people who were frightened and exhausted, and had picked up rifles anyway, who had carried dead men's evidence through floodwater and held it dry against their bodies and walked it into daylight. It had been built by a doctor who told the truth in rooms where the truth was inconvenient, and by workers who had organized on Sunday afternoons while the ground was still frozen, and by an old woman who knew that the difference between rescue and liberation was who did the standing up. It had been built by all of them together. That was what held. The morning deepened. The school bell that Rosa had hung above her classroom door, salvaged from Thorne's executive building, which seemed appropriate, rang out across the yard, clear and carrying. The children came running. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Not the gunfight, not the cliff jump, not even the night in the cave behind the waterfall, when two people built warmth out of necessity and let necessity become something neither of them had a word for yet. The moment I keep coming back to is a Sunday afternoon in February. The ground still frozen. A room full of people, quarry workers, ranchers, a school teacher, a boarding house woman sitting around a table at an old homestead, talking about what they wanted their valley to look like. Not what they were afraid of. Not what had been done to them. What they wanted to build. That's the beating heart of this story. And I think it's worth sitting with for a minute. Because here's what Abigail Fairchild understood that most people in her position never figure out. She rode into Blackwood with a bag full of instruments and a head full of knowledge, and she could have solved this the easy way. She could have extracted the evidence, exposed the villain, rescued the hostages, handed the workers their freedom like a package delivered to the front door. She had the tools. She had the courage. She could have done it alone. But she didn't, because she understood something fundamental about human dignity that doesn't get said out loud nearly enough. A freedom that someone else hands you can be taken back. A freedom you stand up and claim yourself that one holds. That one changes who you are in the standing, and who you are after the standing is different from who you were before it. Not because the danger is gone, but because you know, now in your body and your bones, that you were capable of facing it. Mateo knew that. When he reached out and picked up that rifle in Maeve's main room, he wasn't becoming a different person. He was finally being fully the person he already was. The workers of Blackwood didn't need a hero to save them. They needed a room where they could say the truth out loud, all at the same time, and hear it echo back at them. Abby gave them that room. And yet a man who had spent years believing that his value to the world was measured in the precision of his aim and the accuracy of his judgment in the field learned something too. He learned that, The most important thing he could do in Blackwood wasn't to outshoot anyone. It was to step into the center of the road and hold his ground long enough for everyone else to decide what they were made of. That's not a soldier's job. That's something older and harder and more necessary than soldiering. That's witness. That's presence. That's what it means to stand beside someone instead of in front of them. There's another thing this story does quietly, almost without announcing itself, and it's this. Every single act of healing in it happens in relationship. Abby doesn't heal anyone alone. She heals Jed's shoulder on a rain-slicked road, and he stands between her and 6 armed men. She pulls a bullet out of his side in a river cave, and he holds still and counts backward and trusts her completely. She documents the contamination, and Mateo provides the testimony, and Maeve provides the room, and Rosa provides the distraction at the gate, and Creedy rides east at dawn. Every thread pulls on every other thread. Nothing holds by itself. That's not an accident. That's the architecture of the story's argument. Community isn't a nice idea. It's a load-bearing structure. It holds weight that no single person can hold alone, and the weight it holds is the kind that matters most, the weight of other people's lives, other people's futures, other people's children running in a yard where they are not sorted by the color of their father's skin or the size of their father's bank accounts. The bell Rosa hung above the classroom door came from Thorne's executive building. I love that detail. The very instrument of control, repurposed into a call to learning. That's not poetry. That's what happens when people decide that the structures built to diminish them can be taken apart and remade into something that serves everyone. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, locations, and situations depicted are entirely imaginary and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or places, is purely coincidental. The medical procedures, historical details, and technical descriptions included in this narrative are presented in a fictional context.